1898, Kentucky. In the hills where the fog never lifted, there stood an orphanage that no map cared to name. Its bricks were dark with age, its windows always drawn, as if shielding the children inside from something greater than daylight. The locals spoke of it in half-whispers, not with hatred or pity, but with a caution that had the weight of centuries. What unsettled them was not the cries of children, nor the silence of the halls, but the record books. For in every dusty page, there was no trace of a birth, no account of a death. The orphans who were sent there never seemed to arrive. Those who were rumored to live inside were never seen to leave. And yet, in the glow of certain nights, villagers swore they saw figures in the upper windows, watching the valley with eyes too patient to be young. The parish priest once declared the place a house outside God's ledger. Midwives claimed no child had ever drawn its first breath within those walls, and the gravediggers swore no body had ever been lowered into earth bearing its name. Yet the orphanage endured, filled with children who had no beginnings and no ends. It was not abandoned. It was preserved. A home where time itself seemed reluctant to cross the threshold. Some said the children were borrowed, their shadows taken from elsewhere. Others swore they were fragments of something older, clothed in small bodies, waiting for the world to forget. And it is within the withered ledger that this story is written, the story of an orphanage where no one was ever born, and no one ever died. A place that defies time, faith, and reason, and still waits for someone foolish enough to open its doors. The ledger without names. The train to the hills of Kentucky rattled like an old machine that no longer trusted itself. Its wheels scraped along the rails with a groaning protest, and each jolt seemed to whisper that its passengers should turn back. Yet Dr. Elias Harrow pressed onward, a man of history and obsession, unwilling to heed warnings that did not appear on paper. He was not traveling for pleasure, nor was he searching for profit. Elias had built his life chasing forgotten truths, devouring archives, piecing together fragments of history too unsettling for the polite pages of academic journals. He had been called a scavenger, even a ghoul, for his fascination with the unspeakable. But when a letter reached him bearing the cracked seal of a parish long dissolved, he knew he had found something rare. The letter was short. You seek places outside the record. Come to the orphanage near Black Hollow. You will find no births here, and no deaths. Only names that were never written. The ink was smudged, the handwriting unsteady. There was no signature. Elias read it a dozen times during the journey, each repetition pulling him deeper into its gravity. Whoever had written it was likely gone now, but the words themselves carried a weight he could not refuse. When the train finally shuddered to a halt, he stepped into a valley cloaked in fog that refused to lift. The hour was not yet evening, yet the sun seemed already buried behind the ridges. The damp air clung to his clothes and lungs, and he felt a strange heaviness settle over him. In his satchel he carried ink, paper, and a notebook meant to contain whatever truths this orphanage might reveal. But even before he laid eyes upon the building, Elias felt as though he had already stepped outside the world he knew. The locals were waiting. Not to greet him, but to measure him. Farmers, their hands still raw with earth, and women clutching baskets with needless force, they stood in silence, watching. None approached. None offered direction. Elias cleared his throat and asked once, of a man leaning near the platform, how far to the orphanage. The man spat, crossed himself, and walked away without a word. It was a boy, no older than 12, who finally broke the silence. His voice rasped as though he had spent a lifetime swallowing smoke. You're going there, the boy said. You'll come back with nothing. Or you won't come back at all. Elias adjusted his glasses. And what do you mean by nothing? The boy's eyes narrowed, sharp beyond his years. He stepped backward into the shadows as if retreat itself were an answer. There ain't nothing in that place. Not one thing that belongs to the world. The road to the orphanage was little more than a scar through the woods. Trees pressed close, their branches knotting together in shapes that resembled grasping fingers. Every so often Elias thought he heard movement behind him, but when he turned, there was only the path, vanishing into mist. He walked nearly an hour before he saw it. The orphanage loomed from the valley like a monument no one had wanted. 3 stories high, its stone was stained dark as if scorched by fire, yet the structure stood unbroken. Its windows were shuttered, yet faint cracks in the boards suggested movement inside. A flick of a curtain, the brief silhouette of a hand. The gates were wrought iron, rust eating away at their hinges. They stood open, as though expecting him. Inside, the grounds were barren. Grass did not grow, weeds did not cling to stone. What covered the soil was neither alive nor dead, but brittle stalks that crumbled soundlessly beneath his boots. Elias scribbled quickly into his notebook. Ground sterile. Atmosphere oppressive. Structure intact despite clear neglect. The front door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there, tall and severe. She wore black garments that looked as though they had not been made in this century, her figure draped like a shadow stretched thin. Her face was pale, creased with lines that hinted not at age but at burden. Her eyes were pools of dark glass, reflecting nothing. "You are the one called Harrow," she said, her voice low, toneless. "I am," Elias replied, steadying himself. "And you are the matron, I presume?" She did not confirm. She only turned and walked inside. Elias followed. The hall stretched impossibly long, lanterns flickering in a breeze he could not feel. The walls were bare, save for faint rectangles of lighter paint where portraits had once hung. His footsteps echoed against the stone, but hers made no sound at all. At last she led him into a study. Bookshelves sagged with volumes bound in leather so dry they looked ready to crack to dust. At the center stood a desk, and on it, a single object, a ledger. "This," the matron said softly, "is what you came to see." Elias approached. The book was vast, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, its clasp undone as if it had been consulted recently. He opened to the first page, expecting dates, baptismal records, deaths. But the page was blank. He turned another. Blank. Another. Blank still. All but one. Near the center, faint indentations scarred the paper, as if ink had once lived there but had been devoured by time. Elias leaned close, his fingers tracing grooves where names had been, only to vanish. It was as though someone had pressed words into existence only to erase them not with blade or fire, but with something far more final. "This cannot be right," he muttered. "There must be records. Birth certificates, death notices." The matron's hand slammed the ledger shut. Elias recoiled. Her face had not changed, but her eyes glistened as though with tears that refused to fall. "There are no births here," she said coldly. "There are no deaths. What lives in these halls remains." They gave him a room that night. A narrow bed, a crucifix above the door that looked newer than the rest of the house. He tried to sleep, but the silence pressed against him like cloth over his ears. Several times he thought he heard breathing, not from his room, but from the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. At midnight he rose with his notebook, determined to explore. The corridor stretched pale under the lanterns, and he froze at once. Children, dozens of them, lined neatly along the walls. Their faces were smooth, untouched by time, yet their eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the lantern light too perfectly. They did not whisper. They did not move. They only stared. "Good evening," Elias stammered. "Why are you awake?" One child, a girl of perhaps 7, stepped forward. Her hair was long, her skin wax pale. She opened her mouth as though to answer. But no sound came. Her lips formed a single word, repeated silently. "Ledger." Elias stumbled backward, heart hammering. The children did not follow. They only watched as he fled to his room and locked the door, his breath ragged against the silence. By morning he demanded answers. Over tea, his hands trembling around the cup, he asked the matron where the children came from. "They were always here," she replied. "That is impossible," Elias said. "Every child has a beginning." "Not here," she said firmly. "Here they have only the middle. They are spared the cruelty of beginning, and kept from the agony of end. That is the gift of this house." Elias's hands went cold. You mean to say they are not born? She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a whisper. And they will not die? The air grew colder. Elias felt sweat bead along his temple. He thought of the villagers' silence, the boy's warning, the blank ledger scarred with absences. He understood now that this was not a place of refuge, nor a place of charity. The orphanage was not a home for children. It was a home for names. And in that realization, Elias felt a terror greater than death itself, because names, once unmade, can never be found again. Children who do not age. Morning inside the orphanage did not resemble morning anywhere else. The sun, if it rose at all, gave no proof of itself through the boarded windows. There was light, but it was thin, like water strained through cloth, draining color from everything it touched. Dr. Elias Harrow rose from his narrow bed feeling heavier than when he had lain down. The crucifix above his door seemed to tilt in the dimness, as though sagging under its own futility. He dressed quickly, notebook in hand, and stepped into the hall. The children were waiting. Not in a crowd, as the night before, but scattered in groups. 2 at the base of the staircase, 1 perched on the landing above, 3 more sitting neatly along the corridor wall. They did not move when he passed. They did not whisper, or smile, or frown. They only watched. Elias offered a cautious nod. Good morning. It was then that one of them, a boy of perhaps 10, with hair as pale as straw, tilted his head. Slowly, with deliberate weight, he replied, Good morning. The words were correct, but the sound was wrong. Each syllable carried the stiffness of mimicry, as though he had learned it from listening too long without speaking. Elias cleared his throat. And where might the others be? The boy blinked once, a long pause, and said flatly, They are here. The answer unsettled him more than silence would have. He scribbled quickly in his notebook. Speech rehearsed. Vocabulary intact, cadence unnatural. Sense of age beyond years. The boy stared at the notebook as though he could read it without looking. Breakfast was served in the dining hall. Long wooden tables filled the space, and each child sat perfectly upright, hands folded until the matron gave a slight nod. Then, all at once, they lifted their spoons. No chatter. No clatter. Only the mechanical scrape of metal against bowls, a sound so synchronized it resembled ritual. Elias sat at the end of one table, attempting casual observation. The food, oatmeal, thin and gray, was eaten without hesitation. The children did not complain, nor did they smile. Occasionally, one would laugh. But the laughter was hollow, a sound too sharp at the edges, as though the body knew the rhythm of mirth but had never felt it. He watched one boy in particular. Small, dark-haired, with an expression that suggested centuries pressed into his narrow face. The boy met Elias's gaze without shame. He raised his spoon, paused midair, and said in a voice steady as stone, We do not hunger. Elias set down his pen. Then why do you eat? The boy returned his gaze to the bowl. Because she tells us to. She, Elias repeated. The matron? The boy did not answer. He only resumed eating, spoon moving with exact precision, as though silence itself was the answer. After breakfast, Elias was given permission to walk the dormitories. The matron said nothing of rules, only handed him a lantern and reminded him to look, but do not touch. Her voice lingered in his mind long after she had vanished back into her study. The dormitories stretched endlessly, beds lined in perfect symmetry. Each was made with tight corners, blankets folded with military precision. Children sat upon them, some swinging their legs, others staring at walls as though the paint itself contained secrets. None bickered. None played. It was the stillness that unsettled him most. Children should have chaos woven into their very being, whispers, quarrels, mischief. Yet here, all was order, silence punctured only when one child laughed in that dreadful practiced way, prompting others to mimic it as though on cue. Elias approached a girl who sat on the edge of her bed, combing the same strand of hair over and over. She could not have been older than 8. What is your name? He asked gently. She did not look at him. We do not have them. You must, Elias insisted. Every child is given a name. Her hands stilled in her hair. She turned her face toward him, and he froze. Her eyes were too deep, too patient. Eyes not of a child, but of something that had seen years beyond comprehension. We do not have them anymore, she whispered. That afternoon, Elias joined the matron in the study. The ledger sat unopened on the desk, a weight between them. These children, Elias said, his voice low. They speak, they eat, they play at laughter, but they are not children. The matron's pale lips tightened. And what would you have them be? They are frozen, preserved. I see no scars of time upon them. No growth, no change. They do not age. Her eyes narrowed, yet her voice remained calm. Would you call that a curse, Dr. Harrow? Or a mercy? He felt his throat tighten. Every living thing must age. It is the proof of life. Proof, she echoed. Proof is for those who doubt. We have no need of it here. She rose, moving toward the shelves, her hand gliding across spines of books that looked ready to crumble. This place is not bound to time as you are. Within these walls, they are safe. No beginnings to be torn from them. No endings to drag them away. Only the stillness of the middle. Elias gripped his notebook so tightly it crumpled. And you think that living? Her back was to him. I do not think. I keep. That is all. Night came, though it was hard to tell by the light. The orphanage dimmed, lanterns glowing like distant stars in a fog. Elias did not sleep. He listened. At some hour he could not name, he heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, children's laughter. Not one but many, rising and falling in eerie unison. It was too perfect, each voice chiming on the same rhythm, the same pitch, as though orchestrated by an unseen hand. He crept into the hall, lantern trembling in his grip. The laughter swelled ahead, drawing him toward the main staircase. There they were. A circle of children on the floor, holding hands. Their faces were blank, but their mouths echoed laughter as one. Elias stood frozen, watching as the sound carried not joy, but a kind of hunger. The circle broke. One by one, the children turned to face him. Their laughter ceased instantly. Silence devoured the hall. Then, the girl from earlier, the one who combed her hair, stepped forward. Her eyes met his, unblinking. She whispered, not in the voice of a child, but in something older, rougher, worn. We do not age. But you will. Elias staggered back, breath catching. His lantern flickered. The children did not follow, but their eyes tracked him as he retreated, every step heavier than the last. By dawn, Elias sat in his room, notebook pages filled with frantic scrawl. Children do not age. Laughter rehearsed. Knowledge beyond years. Claim no names, no hunger, no change. He pressed his pen so hard the nib snapped, ink spilling across the paper. He stared at it, trembling, until he realized what unsettled him most. He had written their faces in detail, described their voices, their gestures, their eerie patience. But already, he could not remember their names. Not because they had none. Because whatever names they might once have carried were being unmade, erased even from his memory. And as he looked to the crucifix above his door, sagging slightly against the wall, Elias wondered how long before he too would forget his own. The forbidden dormitory. The second night in the orphanage pressed heavier on Elias Harrow than the first. Sleep refused him, leaving his eyes wide in the dark, haunted by the memory of children laughing in practiced unison. Their voices still echoed in his ears, hollow, ritualistic, as though meant less to express joy than to summon something waiting in the walls. When he finally rose from his bed, the crucifix above his door leaned further, tilting as though gravity itself wished to drag it down. He dressed quickly, clutching his notebook, though his hand trembled as though the pages themselves might slip from memory. He feared not only the children now, but himself. For each time he tried to recall their faces, they blurred at the edges, features he had written clearly yesterday now dissolving like ink in water. By lantern light, he crept through the corridors. It was then he noticed the door. He had passed it before, at the far end of the second-floor hall. A door taller than the others, its frame reinforced with iron. It bore no knob, no handle, only a heavy lock that had rusted into permanence. The matron had never spoken of it, nor had the children gone near. But that night, Elias swore he saw movement beneath it. A shadow shifting in the thin slit at the threshold. The sound came next. A dragging, soft and patient, like fabric pulled across stone. Then silence. Elias's breath quickened. He scribbled furiously. Sealed door. Possible disused dormitory. Activity behind. Confirm if access possible. The floorboard creaked behind him. He turned. The matron stood at the end of the hall, her face half buried in shadow. "You will not open that door," she said. Not stern, not pleading, simply final. Elias swallowed. "Why is it locked?" Her steps echoed as she drew nearer, the black folds of her dress brushing the walls. "Because it must remain so. There are children inside," Elias pressed. "I heard them." Her eyes gleamed with something between fury and grief. "There are no children inside. There are only what remains when a name refuses to fade." Before he could question further, she turned sharply, vanishing down the hall, her silence echoing louder than her words. The following morning, Elias sat among the children in the dining hall, his thoughts chained to the forbidden door. The children ate as before, perfect, synchronized, mechanical. Their laughter rose once, jagged and unnatural, before dying at once as though commanded. He leaned toward the dark-haired boy he had noticed the day before. The boy's eyes flicked to him without emotion. "What is beyond the locked wing?" Elias whispered. The boy's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His lips parted, but no sound came. Slowly, he lowered the spoon and pressed his finger to the table, tracing a circle again and again into the wood. Round and round, faster each time, until his finger blurred. Elias grabbed his wrist. "What does it mean?" The boy's mouth stretched into something like a smile, but it was not mirth. It was knowledge, deep and cruel. "It means we come back," the boy said softly. That night, Elias resolved to see for himself. He waited until the orphanage stilled, until the matron's shadow no longer passed beneath the lanterns. Then, lantern in hand, he returned to the second-floor hall. The door loomed at the end, its lock glinting dully. He ran his fingers along it, testing its give. Rust crumbled under his touch, but the metal held fast. He cursed under his breath, casting about for anything that might serve as leverage. It was then he noticed the key. Not hanging from a hook, not left in the lock, but lying in plain sight on the floor before the door, as though placed there deliberately. Elias hesitated. His heart told him it was a trap. But his mind, ever the historian, burned with the need to know. He bent, picked up the key, and slid it into the lock. It turned with agonizing ease. The door groaned open. The air inside struck him like rot. Thick, damp, stagnant. He lifted the lantern, its light shivering across rows of beds. They were smaller than the ones in the dormitories he had seen, cradles and cots that belonged to infants. Dust cloaked everything, but not enough to disguise the marks. Small handprints smeared across the bed frames, tiny finger marks pressed into the wood, as though dozens of little ones had once clawed to be free. And then he saw the jars. On a shelf running the length of the far wall sat glass jars, sealed with wax. Within each floated something pale and shapeless. At first he thought them medical specimens, remnants of some doctor's twisted collection. But as he drew closer, his stomach turned. They were shadows. Not flesh, not bone, but shadows themselves, bottled and preserved. Each jar contained the faint outline of a small form, limbs folded, faces indistinct. They quivered faintly, as though stirred by breath. Elias nearly dropped the lantern. He scribbled madly into his notebook, words tumbling without order. Jars. Contained shadows. Infants? Preserved essence? Dormitory equals cradle of unmade children. A sound froze him mid-sentence. A sigh. Long, shuddering, almost human. The lantern light shifted. At the far end of the room, one of the cots was not empty. A figure lay upon it, small, swaddled in cloth so tattered it seemed centuries old. Elias stepped closer, compelled against every instinct. The bundle stirred. A face turned toward him. It was not a child's face. It was blank. Smooth flesh where features should be, save for two hollows where eyes belong. The hollows opened, and Elias saw darkness pour from them like smoke. He staggered back, clutching his lantern, notebooks slipping from his grasp. The jars rattled on their shelves, their contents writhing as though agitated by his presence. Then came the voices. Dozens, hundreds, whispering in unison, yet from no single source. Words hissed through the air, familiar and dreadful. Ledger! 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 Elias fled, slamming the door behind him, fumbling with the key until it snapped in his hand. He collapsed against the wall, gasping, heart battering against his ribs. By morning, he tried to speak to the matron, but she would not see him. The children were different that day. Not louder, not wilder, but watching him with sharper intent. Their laughter, when it came, was harsher, more brittle. The girl who combed her hair approached him at the dining hall. Without a word, she slipped something into his hand, a folded scrap of parchment. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. It was a page from the ledger, or what looked to be. Faint indentations marked its surface, words once written now erased. But if he tilted it toward the light, he could just make out the grooves. It was his own name, not written in ink, carved as absence. He looked up sharply, but the girl was already gone, her place at the table empty. That night, Elias barred his door, pressing his weight against it until exhaustion finally claimed him. In his dreams, he stood again in the forbidden dormitory. The jars pulsed with shadows. The blank child on the cot whispered without a mouth, its hollow eyes opening wider and wider until they filled the room with darkness. And within that darkness, he heard a truth that made his soul recoil. The orphanage did not shelter children. It collected beginnings. The matron's prayer. The orphanage had many rooms, but none was as forbidden as the chapel. It was a narrow space at the far end of the eastern wing, its ceiling cracked by age, its floorboards warped with damp. A crooked crucifix hung over the altar, its wood blackened as if licked by fire. No candle had burned there in years, and yet the air always smelled faintly of melted wax and smoke. The children never entered, though sometimes their songs would echo near its door, as if daring the silence to answer them. Petty footsteps and rehearsed laughter filled the corridors, but when they reached the chapel, they fell quiet, like actors leaving the stage. It was here, deep in the heart of night, that the matron knelt. Her knees pressed into the splintered boards, her hands folded, though not in the manner of prayer taught by churches. She did not look at the crucifix. Her head was tilted instead toward the floor, toward the cracks between the planks where shadows pooled thicker than dust. Her lips moved in whispers. Not English. Not Latin. Something that rasped and coiled, a tongue too brittle to belong to the living, too wet to be entirely dead. It was a prayer that seemed to cling to the walls themselves, a prayer that trembled and shook as though unwilling to be spoken. And still she spoke it, night after night. Petru, restless since his discovery of the children's unchanging faces, lingered in the corridor one night and pressed his ear to the chapel door. He expected hymns, perhaps weeping, perhaps nothing at all. What reached him instead was a sound like reeds breaking under water, like syllables pulled apart and forced back together. The matron's voice swelled, cracked, then fell to a hush. And with that hush came another sound. Not hers. The floor itself answered. Petru staggered back, his breath caught sharp in his chest. He pressed himself against the wall, half hoping the prayer would cease. But it only deepened. The cracks between the planks widened, and something below groaned like a sleeper turning in their bed. The matron's prayer was not addressed upward, not heavenward. It was meant for whatever lay beneath. Morning brought no sign of her midnight ritual. She moved through the halls with her stiff grace, her bonnet tied too tightly beneath her chin, her eyes lingering on the children just long enough to remind them to sit straighter, laugh fuller, smile as though they had never known grief. But Petru could no longer unsee what he had glimpsed. He noticed how the children's games always ended in perfect unison, as though someone invisible had whispered, "Stop." He noticed how their laughter rose at precise intervals, never spilling over, never breaking apart in true chaos. And when the matron entered a room, their stillness was absolute. It was not discipline. It was worship. The next night, Petru returned. He crept closer to the chapel, careful this time not to lean against the door but instead to peer through a crack in the warped wood. The matron was kneeling again. Her hands were not folded this time, but pressed flat against the floor. Her palms trembled, her fingernails digging into the splinters until blood welled beneath them. And still she prayed. Petru strained to catch the words. Fragments reached him, words that bent themselves out of recognition: return, remain, preserve. At the altar's foot, the air shimmered, and Petru saw them, faint outlines of children who were not present in the orphanage. Their faces flickered, blurred, like candle flames disturbed by breath. They watched her, heads tilted, lips smiling though their eyes remained hollow. The matron's voice broke, almost weeping now, though not with sorrow, with need. And then the floor answered again. This time, Petru did not flee. He forced himself to listen. The sound came from deep below, deeper than any basement he had ever known. It was not a voice but the friction of countless shadows scraping together, a collective sigh that pulled at his bones. His vision blurred. For a moment, the corridor tilted. He gripped the frame of the door, forcing his breathing steady. The prayer ended with a final word that clung to him like frost. The matron lifted her head. Her face glistened with sweat, her bonnet slipping loose. Her eyes, dull gray, drained of all warmth, stared straight at the door. Petru jerked away, heart hammering. Had she seen him? He could not be certain. But that night, when he returned to his room, the children's laughter followed him. Not outside his door. Inside his dreams. Days blurred. Petru's sense of time frayed, the hours lengthening and contracting in unnatural rhythm. Meals arrived at odd intervals, yet no one seemed hungry. The children played, always the same games, the same laughs, as though the matron's prayer had stitched them into a script from which they could not deviate. He watched their eyes most of all. They were too knowing, yes, but now he realized they were also too patient. Like creatures rehearsing for a moment still to come, waiting for a cue that only the matron would deliver. One evening, he dared to speak to her directly. "Matron," he said, careful, respectful. "The children, do they never grow older?" Her pause was too long. She looked at him as if measuring whether the question itself deserved to exist. "They do not need to," she answered at last. "Here they are safe. Here they are preserved." "Preserved?" Petru echoed. Her lips tightened. "There are places in this world where time itself is cruelty. This house is not such a place. This house is mercy." Her words clung to him, sharper than the prayer. Mercy. Was that what she called it? Mercy to trap children in bodies that never aged, laughter that never changed? Mercy to hold them in a prayer that bound even their shadows? Petru left her presence shaken, but not silenced. He needed to know what lay beneath. That night, when the chapel door creaked open once more, Petru did not remain in the corridor. He stepped inside. The air thickened around him immediately, pressing against his lungs like damp cloth. The crucifix loomed crooked above the altar, its blackened wood shimmering as though it sweated tar. The matron knelt where she always had, though her body seemed smaller somehow, as though her prayer consumed her even as it preserved the children. Her voice wove the forbidden tongue. Petru crouched low, keeping to the shadows. The outlines of unseen children appeared again near the altar, their forms twitching in and out of focus. Their mouths opened, but no sound escaped. Their silence was worse than screaming. And then the floor groaned. A crack widened beneath the matron's hands, stretching across the boards. Darkness welled up, thicker than pitch, spilling like ink. The smell of burnt wax deepened, and Petru's eyes watered. The matron's prayer surged. Her voice broke into sobs, and with each sob, the figures sharpened, faces forming in detail, Lips cracked, teeth too many, eyes that belonged to no child. They leaned toward her. She pressed her bloodied hands deeper into the floor. "Stay," she whispered. "Remain. I am faithful." The ground shuddered. The altar trembled. For a moment, Petru thought the entire orphanage might collapse into the thing beneath. And then, silence. The matron slumped, exhausted, her forehead resting on the boards. The shadows retreated, the figures dissolved. Petru, heart pounding, slipped from the chapel. He knew, now, that the orphanage's secret was not simply stillness. It was prayer. A prayer that fed something hidden below. A prayer that preserved the children not for life, nor for mercy, but for an offering still unfinished. And the matron was its priest. That night, as Petru lay awake, the laughter came again. But this time, it was not rehearsed. It was eager. As though the children had overheard the prayer, and were waiting for the day it would finally be answered. The candle that burns in reverse. The orphanage had long abandoned the pretense of ordinary time. In the beginning, one might have mistaken its peculiarities for quirks of old construction, a clock whose pendulum swung too slowly, floorboards that sighed as if echoing the past rather than bearing the present, children who seemed suspended in some gentle spell of stillness. But by the time the candle first burned in reverse, all pretense of the natural world had been stripped away. It happened in the refectory, that vast dining hall with its ceiling beams blackened by centuries of smoke and incense. On that evening, a storm rumbled over the Kentucky hills, the windows shuddering as if eager to split their frames. The orphans sat at their long tables, bowls of soup cooling untouched before them. Their eyes, too many for the silence, fixed upon the altar at the far end of the hall, where a single tall candle stood lit in a wrought iron holder. The flame had been steady for hours, its wax pulled neatly at its base. Yet when the storm rolled through, the wick bent backward, and the wax that had dripped onto the altar stone began to crawl upward, hardening again into the shape of the candle. The children did not gasp. They did not whisper. Instead, they smiled as though seeing something expected at last. Father Keene, who had returned once more to test the orphanage with the weight of his faith, crossed himself and whispered a trembling prayer. The matron, seated across from him, placed a firm hand on the table. "This house does not obey hours as you know them, Father," she said softly. "It remembers before the beginning, and it rehearses what comes after the end." The storm outside pressed harder against the glass, and for a moment it seemed the thunder had spoken in words too low to catch. The children turned their heads in unison, their faces bright in the candle's backward glow. They were not startled by the reversal of flame and wax, nor by the shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the walls. Those shadows bent away from their small bodies, clawing toward the ceiling beams as though striving to return to the rafters rather than remain tethered to flesh. Keene's rosary shook in his grip. "This is mockery," he hissed. "An illusion to unseat the faithful." The matron smiled thinly, her lined face serene. "No, Father. It is memory. The house remembers when time had not yet chosen its direction." She rose and moved to the altar. The children's eyes followed her every step, though their heads did not turn. Their stillness was more than discipline. It was a dreadful unity, as though each child's body were only a fragment of something larger, each pair of hands folded neatly in their laps like pieces of one vast and invisible being. The matron lifted the candle holder with both hands. Wax slithered upward from the stone and rejoined the base of the taper. The flame glowed, defying the storm's wind, and burned with the calmness of an eternal beginning. "When you see a candle burn forward," the matron said, her voice carrying easily across the hall, "you believe you are watching time consume itself. You believe you are watching death in miniature. But here, Father, we do not burn forward. We are not consumed. We return." Her words echoed like psalms spoken in a tongue older than any parish. The orphans finally lifted their spoons, dipping into their bowls in the same instant, raising them to their lips in choreographed silence. Each swallow sounded louder than thunder. Their eyes shone, reflecting the backward flame, and for a moment Father Keene thought he saw the same face in every child, a repetition with slight variations, as if their individuality were merely a trick of the light. The shadows writhed. They moved across the walls, but not with the rhythm of the storm outside. Instead, they bent against the flame's reversal, growing sharper, more angular, their joints bent wrong, their limbs lengthened. One shadow slipped free of its child entirely, climbing the wall like a black rope, spreading across the ceiling beams. Keen staggered back. "This cannot be!" The matron placed the candle back upon the altar, its wax once again whole, unspent, unscarred by time. "You should not have come again, Father. The ledger warned you." Her eyes glimmered as she gestured toward the great book that rested always upon the refectory lectern. Keen had seen its pages before, a chronicle without names, lines of ink drawn too precisely, spaces too expectant, as though waiting for events that had not yet occurred. He had resisted looking again, but now the children's eyes directed him, pressing upon him like a silent congregation. He approached the lectern. The ledger was open to a fresh page. At first he thought it blank, but as the storm's lightning flashed through the tall windows, he saw faint writing appear, letters etched in light and shadow rather than ink. They shimmered, then settled into words: "The candle that burns in reverse. The night that refuses to end. The man who will speak when silence is demanded." His heart seized. He touched the words, but they blurred beneath his fingers, as though his flesh could not hold them. He staggered back, muttering prayers, but the children whispered as one. "Stay. Stay. Stay." The matron returned to her chair. She folded her hands neatly, her eyes soft and almost tender. "You see now, Father. The house is not against God. It is before Him. It does not defy the beginning. It remembers a world before beginnings mattered." The candle flickered once, and the shadows on the wall shrieked without sound. Their mouths opened in voiceless screams, yet the children smiled and sipped their soup. The wax continued its upward climb, filling itself whole, erasing every trace of consumption. Father Keen collapsed to his knees. He realized that if no candle ever truly burned, if no flame ever consumed its own wick, then no moment had ever passed. No child had ever grown older. No birth had ever begun, no death had ever ended. All was trapped in a circle, or worse, a refusal of all circles, a straight path that led nowhere, because it had no direction at all. "Why do you keep them?" he cried. "Why these children? Why trap them in this stillness?" The matron's answer was as calm as the storm was violent. "Because they are fragments. And fragments must wait for the whole." The lightning roared against the glass, and the candle blazed brighter than the storm's fury. The shadows stretched until they nearly split the rafters. And in that instant, Keen knew that time itself was bending around the orphanage, not simply halting, not simply looping, but preparing. The children, who had never aged, whispered together in a harmony too perfect to be human. "The candle returns. The flesh returns. The hour will not be kept away forever." And the storm passed, leaving the world outside washed and fragile. But within the orphanage, the candle glowed eternal, unspent, unwounded. A flame that reversed the order of things, bending time into something that could no longer be endured, nor escaped. The hour of unmaking. Midnight had always pressed differently upon the orphanage, as if its walls held their own hourglass, one unmirrored from the clocks of the world outside. Tonight, however, I knew something was coming. The matron's voice had been a constant murmur all day, not her usual hymns of hollow comfort, but whispers that curled like smoke under doors. Her words did not carry the sound of prayer, they carried the weight of command. The children had been herded into the chapel before the last bell tolled. Their eyes shone with a brittle excitement, the kind that belongs less to children and more to disciples awaiting a secret revelation. Their laughter, that strange too-practiced sound, had fallen completely silent. Even their stillness was not the stillness of fear, but of anticipation. I realized, with a dread that shook me to my marrow, that they had been waiting for this night all along. The chapel was lit not by the usual oil lamps but by tall candles that burned with a peculiar glow. Their flames leaned downward, dragging their light into the wax, as though every law of fire had been inverted. The shadows in the room no longer clung to corners, They hovered near the ceiling, shuddering in slow, reluctant movements, like figures trapped behind glass. The matron stood at the altar, her black dress trailing the stone steps. She did not hold the Bible. Instead, her hands gripped a book bound in something that was not leather but resembled skin stretched too thin. Its cover bore no title. Its pages, when she lifted them to read, released a rustling sound like dry leaves scattered across graves. "This is the hour," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The hour when beginnings and endings are unmade. The hour when we are fed." The words struck me not as metaphor, but as a statement of fact. The children began to hum. At first, it was low and broken, an imitation of song, but soon it gathered into a harmony so exact, so rehearsed, that I could not believe it came from their small throats. Their voices rose and fell in a chant that bent language itself. I heard syllables I did not know could exist, as though they had been uttered before human tongues had learned to form words. The matron lifted her head, her face tilted toward the shadowed ceiling. "There is no birth," she intoned. "There is no death. There is only the feeding, and the unmaking, and the hour that has no hour." And then I saw it. From the ceiling shadows, figures began to drip downward. Not like bodies descending, but like ink sliding from paper. Their shapes elongated and swirled until they took forms both familiar and alien. Some appeared almost human, their limbs too long, their heads bent as if in sorrow. Others were nothing but masses of shifting darkness, with mouths that opened and closed silently, as if chewing on time itself. The children stretched their arms upward in unison. Their hands did not tremble. Their faces were radiant with devotion, their smiles wide, eyes gleaming with the hunger of belonging. The matron turned a page of the book, her fingers tracing symbols that glowed faintly as she spoke them aloud. I realized that the words were not prayers but bargains, contracts etched into the air itself. The chapel filled with a pressure so immense that I felt my chest tighten, as though the walls were closing in and the air had forgotten how to be air. Then the ritual revealed its truth. One of the candles at the altar began to unburn. Its melted wax climbed back into its taper, the flame shrinking upward, pulling light into darkness. Around it, the other candles followed, reversing themselves, consuming their own undone fire. As the flames retracted, the shadows grew heavier, denser, until the air seemed woven with their threads. The matron's voice thundered. "Here is where the circle closes. Here is where the feast begins." A boy stepped forward from the front row. His face was round and childlike, but when his eyes turned toward me, I saw in them a depth that no child should hold, an eternity masquerading as youth. He opened his mouth and exhaled, but no breath emerged. Instead, something invisible yet immense poured into the chapel, a ripple that struck every candle, every wall, every shadow. The shadows bent inwards, drawn toward the children, and I understood. This orphanage did not keep the children alive by withholding beginnings and endings. It fed. It drank from the well of both. Every birth denied, every death delayed, was a morsel, a currency, consumed by the unseen thing that nested in the rafters of time. The children were not spared from the world's laws. They were the instruments of its defiance. The matron raised her hands high, her book trembling in her grip. "Do you see?" she cried, her eyes blazing. "The world beyond hungers for order, for the tyranny of beginnings and endings. But here, in this house, we are free. We feed the eternal, and it feeds us. No birth, no death, only the hour of unmaking." The children repeated her last words, their voices swelling to a shriek. "The hour of unmaking! The hour of unmaking!" And then, at once, the chapel floor split open. Not with noise, not with stone cracking, but with silence. A perfect, absolute silence that carved through sound itself. Below us yawned not earth but void, a fathomless gulf that had no bottom, no top, no dimension at all. From it surged not heat nor cold, but a sensation so alien I could only describe it as the absence of all sensation. It was not emptiness. It was the undoing of existence itself. The matron bent low over the altar, her lips pressed to the pages of her book, whispering secrets I dared not hear. The children swayed as one body, their faces glowing with ecstasy. Some clutched their chests, as though feeling the beat of hearts they did not possess. Others laughed, a hollow, rhythmic sound that echoed against the silence below. I stood frozen at the back, every instinct telling me to flee, yet my legs rooted by some force beyond fear. I knew that if I turned to run, the chapel doors would not open. The orphanage had closed around me. I was a witness, and witnesses were meant to be consumed. Then, from the void below, something stirred. It was not shape, nor sound, but an awareness. It brushed against me like a cold hand laid upon the spine, and I felt myself unraveling at its touch. Not dying, for death was not possible here, but unwinding, as though my memories, my beginnings, my inevitable end were being picked apart, thread by thread. The matron's voice rose into a scream. "Feed, O timeless one! Take from us what the world denies! Drink beginnings! Devour endings! Leave us in the freedom of forever!" The void answered not with noise, but with motion. The shadows that had lingered above now fell completely into it, dissolving as they touched its surface. The children's laughter sharpened, becoming a chorus of knives. One by one, they thrust their hands into the air, and from their palms spilled light, pale, brittle strands, like threads of dawn and dusk. Those threads fell into the void, which drank them greedily, swelling with each offering. I understood, too late, that what they gave was not light. It was the very essence of beginnings and endings, ripped from themselves, surrendered willingly. Their lives were no longer a sequence of moments. They had become vessels of an eternal ritual, stripped of the simple mercy of time. The void grew brighter, a brilliance without warmth, and for a moment, the chapel seemed to hover on the edge of nothingness. The walls wavered, the ceiling bowed, the air trembled as if it were about to collapse into that unmaking. The matron lowered her arms, her voice a whisper now. "It is done! The hour of unmaking has fed. We remain. Forever we remain." The candles stood whole again, unburned, their flames steady and upright. The void beneath the floor vanished as if it had never been, leaving only the cold stone tiles. The children sat back in their pews, folding their hands in their laps, serene, smiling, patient. Only I trembled. Only I still remembered the sensation of being unwound. And in that silence, I realized the truth that turned my stomach to ice. The hour of unmaking was not confined to this orphanage. Every time they performed it, some small fracture in the natural order rippled outward. Somewhere in the world, a child never born was erased from memory. Somewhere, a death that should have freed a suffering body was denied. The orphanage fed, and the world bent beneath its hunger. The matron closed her book and looked at me. Her eyes gleamed like polished stone. "You understand now," she said softly. "There is no escape. You have been written into the ledger. You will not be born again. You will not die. You will remain." And with those words I knew, beginnings and endings had abandoned me. I was theirs. No birth, no death. The last night in the orphanage was not a night at all. It was a suspension, a pause in the machinery of hours, as if the bells of midnight had been struck and then left trembling in the air, their resonance refusing to fade. I could feel it in my lungs. Every breath refused to finish. Inhaling became an endless act, exhaling incomplete. The air was trapped, and so was I. The corridors hummed with a sound I had not heard before, like pages turning in 1,000 invisible ledgers, all at once. They whispered against each other, parchment against parchment, the crackle of unending records. But no name was spoken aloud. Not mine, not theirs. For in this place, there were no births to begin, and no deaths to conclude. The children lined the hall, each one perfectly still, their small chests rising only enough to suggest life but not enough to prove it. Their eyes reflected the candles that burned in reverse, talening as the wax reassembled itself, smoke retreating into flame. When I passed them, they did not move. They did not need to. Their silence was participation. Their silence was acceptance. At the far end of the hall, the matron waited. She no longer pretended to be merely human. The folds of her black dress stretched unnaturally, falling like curtains that had been hung too high, trailing endlessly across the floor. Her hands were clasped in prayer, but her lips did not move. The prayer was being spoken elsewhere, in my mind, in the walls, in the marrow of the building itself. "Do you see now?" she asked. Her voice arrived without sound, like thought passing from one head to another. "Do you see why no one is born here, why no one dies here?" I wanted to deny her, to spit defiance, but the words would not leave my throat. They lingered, half-formed, like a name forgotten just as it was about to be spoken. The matron turned, beckoning me to follow. She led me into the great hall I had seen only once before, the place where the midnight rite had unfolded, where I had first glimpsed the true shape of the orphanage's purpose. Now the hall was filled. Every child stood in rows, their faces blank, their hands folded as though in prayer. They stared forward, unblinking, toward the altar at the center of the room. The altar was not built of stone. It was not wood, nor iron. It was a structure of memory itself, formed from the relics of beginnings that had been stolen. I saw a cradle without a child, a book without its first page, a bell with no clapper, a wedding band without a union. Objects of incompletion, tokens of things that should have begun but were denied the chance. They glowed faintly, like embers that had chosen not to burn. "The hour of unmaking has passed," the matron intoned. "Now comes the hour of absorption. You came to write history, but history is only a cycle of starts and endings. We have no need of such illusions here. We strip them away. We keep what is left." I tried to step back, but the children shifted as one body. Their heads turned in perfect unison, their eyes fixing on me, not with malice but with inevitability. They did not wish me harm. They wished me to join. The matron gestured to the altar. Upon it lay a single book, thin and incomplete, its leather cover stiff with disuse. I knew instantly what it was. My ledger. Not the one I carried, but the one that should have been mine, the record of my own life. Yet when I moved closer, I saw that the pages were almost entirely blank. Only the faintest impressions existed, the memory of my birth, written without ink, and a final page that waited without a word. "This is why you came," the matron whispered. "You thought you sought to record us, but we sought to record you. Do you think you wandered here by chance? That your curiosity was your own? No. We called you. We called you because you were already written here, and you did not even know it." I wanted to reach for the book, to clutch it to my chest, to run. But when I stretched out my hand, the cover did not yield. Instead, it opened on its own, and a quill appeared above the page, hovering as if waiting for instruction. It did not wait long. Without my command, it began to write. I watched in horror as letters carved themselves into the parchment, strokes forming words I had never chosen. "He came to the orphanage in 1898. He entered as a man. He remained as a child." My knees weakened. The matron's prayer deepened, vibrating through the hall. The children began to hum, not with their throats, but with their bones, a resonance that rattled the windows. The candle flames bent inward, their light collapsing toward the altar. Shadows no longer obeyed. They moved against me, pressing me forward, drawing me step by step. I tried to resist. I tried to scream. I thought of the world outside, the town, the library, the road that had led me here. But the memories grew soft, as if water had been poured over them. My name, once sharp and certain, blurred into indistinction. The matron lifted her hands. "You wish to know why no child here grows older, why no one here perishes. It is because they are neither born nor dead. They are what remains when those lies are stripped away. They are what remains when history itself is undone. And now, so are you." The quill scratched again. He forgot his past. He forgot his end. He forgot his name. The altar shuddered. The book's blank pages filled with absence, and in that absence I felt myself unravel. My shoulders shrank, my arms lightened. My voice slipped into silence. I looked at my own hands, and they were smaller, smoother, unlined. I ran to the window, desperate for reflection. Outside, the night was vast and starless. But in the glass I saw them, the children. Their faces, pale and timeless. And among them, mine. I had become one of them. The matron's voice followed me into the reflection. No birth. No death. Only the stillness between. You are safe now, child. You are safe forever. But safety was not what I felt. What I felt was erasure. What I felt was the endless silence of a name that would never be spoken again. And so, when travelers pass the orphanage, when the rare wanderer dares to lift their eyes to its crooked windows, they sometimes swear they see a new face among the children, watching, waiting. A face that looks not quite like the others. A face that once belonged to a historian who sought to record the orphanage, but instead was recorded by it. His ledger was closed. His story unfinished. And the orphanage remained. For no one was ever born there. No one ever died there. And that is what makes it terrifying.